So, welcome to Emma Burnell on this very special State of the Race edition of the Democratically 2020 podcast. For those of you who are watching this podcast on video, this is a first attempt at a video version of what is normally an audio-only podcast, because this week I want to take you through a presentation that talks about my assessment of the state of the race so far. We're going to be looking at the whole race. So we'll be looking at the presidency, also obviously looking at our Democratic prospects in the Senate, the House of Representatives, and also taking a little look at some gubernatorial and local races. What I'll do is we'll just kind of pause and have a little chat after I go through each of these major offices, and Emma and I can just have a little conversation about kind of what we think about it. But I did think it was useful to just set out my thoughts. So Emma, does that all make sense?
It does. The only thing I would say to you is you've made the same mistake the Obama team made, which is putting the presidency first and the gubernatorial local races last. But you know, we can nitpick.
100%. Well, I guess you know what. To be honest, part of me, I just wanted to get that out of the way because I know a lot of people dial into my podcast just to be like, "What's happening with the presidential race?" But the sting in the tail is that none of it matters if we don't get the local races right. So.
100%.
100%. So we will cover that more when we get to it. But before we even talk about the presidency, I think we just have to nod to what a bizarre time this is for anyone to be running for office at any level. The Biden campaign and all of the people who are running for office these days, of course, we all expect, there's a long tradition in American politics and politics everywhere, I think, of voter engagement being a very high touch exercise. And whilst advertising is really important, I'm a field person. I've always been a big advocate for all the work that we do on the ground through events, through rallies, through door knocking, phone calls we can still do. But so many of the things that makes politics rich and rewarding and make it persuadable and bring people into the civic society and the democracy that we cherish are not possible, at least while the virus continues to rampage across the country. So although, as we'll talk about a little bit, the virus has caused lots of problems for Donald Trump's campaign, it's also causing lots of problems for anyone running for office and for all of the work that we need to do. It makes it harder to get our volunteers organized. It makes it harder for us to get out the vote. It means canvassing and persuasion has to happen in totally different ways than it has before, which means that we're going to have to be really smart, really agile, really thoughtful, really creative about ways to make that happen. And it may not be ideal to have one of the oldest nominees, if not the oldest nominee we've ever had, but we got
the most agile.
not necessarily thinking in an agile way. But on the other hand, there are some really smart people in the party, and I very much hope that we will, at every level of office, that we'll be creative and thoughtful and innovative about how to meet this challenge. So let's just think of that as kind of the underlying, the sort of leitmotif, the background melody that's going to underpin all of our thinking about these races. So the big question, working, as Emma says, probably backwards in order of importance from what really matters, but the one that's on everyone's mind is the presidency. Where do we stand in the presidential race right now? The thing is with Joe Biden, he's been amazingly consistently, about 6 points ahead of Donald Trump in national polls. Now, obviously, as we'll come on to, national is not everything. Hillary Clinton won the national polling and indeed won the national election, but lost in the critical swing states. But the consistency of it is really interesting, and that's something that we didn't see in 2016. 2016 was a really volatile race, and even though Clinton was leading for most of it, we saw a lot of ups and downs, and we saw a large number of undecided voters until the very, very end of the race. We're seeing fewer undecideds in this race, and we're seeing much less volatility, which I think we should take as a good sign. Having said that, 6 points is not enough for the race to not be close. Because we obviously have a lot of other headwinds that we're facing. As previously discussed, there's the get out the vote challenge that we have, but there is also just the fact that the electoral college makeup of the nation is disfavorable to Democratic candidates as a general rule in its current makeup. And that obviously came to life very clearly in the last election, where Trump lost by about nearly 3 points, but still took the presidency. That's still the case. And in fact, some people argue that the Electoral College margin might be, disadvantage might be bigger for Democrats this time. So a 6-point margin is probably still a pretty close race. And we're far from feeling confident that that's the case. One bit of good news, though, is that we have more than one path to the presidency. Obviously, in 2016, Clinton famously lost Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Those 3 states are still our best path back into the presidency. So absolutely, we still need to focus on them. And the good news is that Michigan and Pennsylvania have been looking very positive, and Wisconsin has been looking very, very close. So, sometimes Trump comes out ahead, sometimes Biden comes out ahead. I think Biden more recently has been a few points ahead in Wisconsin as well as the other 2 states, but it's always very close. And there's a lot of opportunities there for voter suppression and shenanigans, malarkey.
Oh, yeah.
To cause problems. So I think although those 3 states remain important, what we really want to be able to do is open up other paths. And the good news is we also have other paths. The most obvious one right now looks like Arizona, where Democrats are performing really, really well, as we'll talk about both in the Senate race and also in the in the presidential race. Other ones to watch are North Carolina and Florida, as you can see from this map. Florida has a lot of electoral votes at stake. So if we win Florida, we're pretty much not guaranteed, but I think it would be hard to lose the election for a Democrat whilst winning Florida. But we also have North Carolina, which I think is probably more of a stretch, but because it's demographically similar to Virginia, which has become increasingly Democratic, and because it's polling very close, it's a pretty good prospect. We'll call that a wild card. You might also want to say maybe places like Georgia, maybe places like Iowa. I personally think those are probably a little too far outside of reach for this election, but in a swing, in a chaotic election with a lot happening and in the background of a virus, who knows, anything could happen. One thing to watch in particular that I think we should be especially encouraged by, though, is a very specific demographic problem that Trump has, which is that he swept into office primarily, well, not primarily, but in part with a lot of support from older voters, and he is losing those. It's kind of popular. People like to say, oh, well, there's nothing that Trump can do to lose his voters. Well, that's not true. He is losing older voters right now, and he is losing their support by a pretty high margin. That's good news, not only because older voters tend to vote reliably, but also because they're well represented in some of those critical states. Particularly Florida, Ohio, Wisconsin, some of those northern states. There are a lot of older voters, and that's a really good prospect for us. Emma, what's your take on all this? Have I been too optimistic?
I mean, it's an optimistic-ish take, but I don't think it's unrealistic. I don't think you've been too optimistic. I think you have given a sunny show of reality.
Yeah.
I think particularly that last slide is the most important because, I think the 6-point lead worries me a little bit because where is that lead? And I think so many people have made up their minds about Trump and, to be fair, Biden, that it concerns me that what you'll get is piling up of votes in places that were always going to be Democratic, and much, much tighter races where we don't want them to be. So that a consistent 6-point lead is better than a consistent 5-point lead or 4-point lead or 3-point lead. But a national polling in the US, given the Electoral College, drives me slightly nuts.
Yep. I mean, the good news is the state-by-state polling is also looking good for us, but I'm hesitant to rely on it because there hasn't been very much of it.
There hasn't been enough for it to be comprehensive or feel, I mean, I don't want to come across all Nate Silver, mainly because I'm a Claire Malone kind of a gal, but yeah, I don't know that trying to build a comprehensive picture out of what is out there at the moment is a good use of polling.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure we will get tons more swing state polls as time goes on. Right now, we don't have a lot of data to work from, but the data we have, I would say, is cautiously encouraging. And,
And I think that's it, this last slide about the age group, because frankly, it's not so much can Biden win it, but can Trump lose it, and that's what tells me that Trump could lose it.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, although, as I alluded to earlier, there are probably some disadvantages to Biden being an older voter, an older candidate. But there are also some advantages. He has some affinity with this age group. They know him. He's been around a long time. There's a lot of familiarity. A group of voters that tend to be very risk averse and very uncomfortable with change. Biden's not big change. Now, us Elizabeth Warren supporters and certainly the Bernie Sanders supporters out there might say that's a shame. But for the voters who are wary and who think that Trump has been too much change, Biden might be an encouraging return to form for them.
Yeah, I think there was a sense 4 years ago that things were too calm. And the no drama Obama thing was all very well, but actually post 2008, we needed a little bit more drama.
Yeah.
And Hillary was certainly not offering that. Trump was going to drain the swamp. He was offering whirlwind change in a very specific way. Now, what he's given us is all whirlwind, but actually no change from the corruption that people rightly or wrongly envisaged was deep in Washington.
I think there's plenty of change. It's just all been in the wrong direction.
Exactly. Yeah, he hasn't changed the perception of corruption. He's changed the reality of it.
Yes. Yeah.
And also, I think that after 4 years of just, endless partisan drama and war and warfare, people are tired, but people are very, very partisan. You just have to look to the different groups' responses to the coronavirus. That having a partisan effect is insane, but it absolutely does. But I also think that I think by the time we've been in this pandemic for nearly a year and people are coming to vote, I think people are just going to want a bit of normal, a bit of old normal. And, I think Biden's a good representative of old normal. That could possibly be his nickname.
It works pretty well as a strapline. Joe Biden, old normal.
Yeah.
Right. Shall we move on to the Senate?
Absolutely.
So, in the Senate, the challenge Democrats have is we need to pick up, it depends whether we win the presidency or not, because, basic civics lesson, the vice president casts the deciding vote in senatorial ties. So we need about 4 seats to win the presidency, if we win the presidency, or 5 seats if we don't win the presidency. And that's working on the assumption, which looks likely, that we most likely will lose Doug Jones's seat in Alabama. Now, it hurts me to say that because he is a fantastic guy and a fantastic candidate for that state.
But that was a one-off storm, wasn't it?
He's a Democrat in Alabama. And for those who don't remember, Doug Jones, he won his race very, very narrowly in Alabama after competing against Roy Moore, who had multiple allegations of basically child abuse, sexual harassment of minors. So not a great candidate for that for any state. And he was a great candidate. He is a great candidate. He's been a really good senator. But Alabama, at the end of the day, is Alabama. And right now there are 2 candidates in the Republican primary, both of whom are polling pretty well against Doug Jones, one being Jeff Sessions, the former attorney general, who is also a former senator for Alabama. So he would be reclaiming basically his old job. And the other, whose name I can never remember, but basically a college football coach, which, I mean... There you go. So let's assume we need 4 seats or 5 seats. Where could those seats come from? Well, we've got really good prospects in Arizona, which I'll talk about a little bit more. Colorado is fantastic. Maine, Susan Collins, I'll come on to in a little bit. Montana, surprisingly, and North Carolina. We've also got some chance. So we're currently ahead in all of those states, if you believe the polling, which you may or may not. And again, voter suppression, polling error, all these things are factors, and things can change. States where we're not currently ahead, but where we have some reasonable chances, include places like Iowa. There are 2 elections in Georgia, one special election and one regularly scheduled election. And even in places like, Kentucky, although Mitch McConnell obviously is in a strong conservative state, he's pretty unpopular in his state. And we have a really strong contender in Amy McGrath. Now, I don't expect us to win that, but it would be wonderful to be competitive. And I think we can be competitive. Kansas, Chris Kobach, who's a very unpopular and politician who recently lost a governor's race, I think, in that state, is likely to be, or is in prospect to be, the Republican nominee, which I think would be bad for them and good for us. So there are opportunities here. So if we take...
I'm slightly confused by the colouring.
So the brown is too close to call, according to this calculation.
But the grey, I've got California and Nevada.
Gray are states that do not currently have Senate races.
Oh, okay, fine. So they'll already be seated. Right.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So remember, not every Senate seat is up for election in every.
It's not like a general election over here where everyone goes at once.
Exactly. Only a third of the Senate is up for election at any one time. And normally you would never have 2 Senate seats from the same state up at the same time. It's only because we have a special election in Georgia that's happening.
Makes total sense. I was just looking at, I think California, I'm fairly sure. I'm fairly confident I know which ways that's going to go. And the same with Utah. So.
Yeah, no, totally fair question. And it just goes to show how much I take for granted as a... sort
of thing I ought to know, really, given how often I'm on this podcast.
So I thought it was just worth flagging a couple of Senate races that are particularly interesting and worth watching. This one is really cool. This is the Arizona Senate race. Mark Kelly, who is the husband of Gabrielle Giffords, who you may remember tragically, she was shot by, she was a representative who was shot in a terrible mass shooting. My daughter's just walked in behind me, that's why.
Classic podcast.
It's podcasting. He is also a former astronaut and generally a former astronaut. Sophie, honey, I'm recording this. Can you go away, please? Sorry, sweetie.
Bye.
Close the door. He is currently polling well ahead in all of the recent polls that we've seen from Arizona. So that's really good news and looks like a really good prospect. Arizona is also a critical presidential opportunity for us. So that's going to be good news should that come through.
And don't we have one of the Arizona seats already?
Yes, we do. We picked it up in 2018, and the person who lost against, her name's gone out of my head, but sorry, yeah, that's right. Against Kristen Sinema is Martha McSally, who is the current candidate against Mark Kelly for the Republican.
So it's already failed to be popular once.
She already failed to win one time, and now she's up against arguably an even more popular politician. So we feel pretty good about the seat. If we don't win this seat on election night, then I would start to be, I would be concerned. Right. This is Sarah Gideon. Sarah Gideon is likely to be, we still haven't had our primary, but likely to be the Democratic nominee to run against Susan Collins in Maine. Collins is the last remaining Democrat in the Northeast in New England, which is a...
you mean the last remaining Republican?
Republican, yes, sorry. Last remaining Republican in... deep breath. Sarah Gideon. Sarah is an interesting one because although a prominent politician in the state of Maine, I would say she doesn't have a big national profile, as you'd be looking for. So one of the other things that I think might be holding her back is she's raised a fair amount of money, but not compared to some other candidates in other races. So if you're a donor who's trying to think about where to put some money, I think Sarah Gideon would be a good one to put some money into right now.
I mean, Susan Collins is such an interesting target, isn't she? Because there's long been this argument about her that, but she's one of those, she's a more reasonable Republican. Maybe we need to keep Republicans like her in the Senate so that, when they come back to their senses, some of them are still there. but she just votes with Trump all the time. So actually, fuck her. Sorry, I don't know if you use that language on your podcast, but to hell with her. And it's just, at the end of the day, a win's a win, and a seat's a seat. And I think if this is where the target is, it doesn't matter who the target's against, whether it's Susan Collins or Mitch McConnell.
Yeah, I think Susan Collins is particularly vulnerable right now because of the Brett Kavanaugh nomination. When she voted for him, which tipped the balance in the court, potentially in the direction of overturning abortion rights in the near future, I think she sort of violated a compact, an unwritten compact that she had with the voters of Maine, which said, "I will do." I may not be, aligned with the party that you support, but I will do no harm. And I think a lot of voters, especially female voters, feel that she's really broken an article of faith and trust that they had in her, that she would do enough to protect abortion rights. So.
Yeah, and I think it's not necessarily about mad turnout for this nice-looking lady with excellent taste in pearls. But more, I guess suppressing the previous Democrat but likes Collins vote.
Yeah, 100%. But I would like to see Sarah Gideon raise her profile. I would like to see people talking about her a bit more than they are, because I think we're going to.
I suppose that's why a national profile matters, isn't it, in fundraising?
Mm-hmm. It matters for fundraising for sure, but we'll see. The voters of Maine have stuck with Susan Collins to date, but she's polling worse than she ever has, and she has more. I would argue, kind of a more credible opposition than she's had before, and of course the partisan makeup of the country and the polarization split that we've seen might make it impossible for a Republican to hold a seat in Maine going forward. And finally, of course, there's this guy.
This guy.
Well, this is one of our...
And that's an interesting shot you've chosen there, Karin.
Now. This is Montana Governor Steve Bullock.
From one of the debates.
From one of the debates, yeah, he was indeed a presidential candidate, and didn't disgrace himself, just didn't really take off either. He was but he's whatever his profile may be nationally, he's a very popular governor of the state of Montana, and his poll ratings have, if anything, only gone up during the coronavirus crisis, which he's perceived as having handled very well. He is a Democrat in a very Republican-leaning state. Montana is definitely not safe territory for any Democrat, but Steve Bullock has performed very well there. And he announced his candidacy for the Senate there on the final day of the filing deadline, just a month or two ago, I think. Instantly converting that race from a sure thing Republican race to pretty much a break even. So this is not one that we necessarily had on our target list, but when Bullock was persuaded to run in Montana, a lot of interest went there. And I think this is a really great example of how a Democrat can potentially outperform the presidential candidate in a state, because I wouldn't expect Joe Biden to come close in Montana, but Steve Bullock has a really strong history of winning against trend.
I'm sorry, I'm going to take this slightly back because I am just fascinated by so many different aspects of this photo. First of all, why is he leaning on a mic stand with someone holding up a mic for him?
I cannot tell you.
So that's my first question. Secondly, okay, I'm guessing that one's an iPhone. What's the round one over here?
For my audio listeners, he's got something in his pocket. Maybe it's chewing tobacco.
Maybe throat lozenges. I don't know.
Yeah,
this is an image. It's an image of strength. He looks way hotter than I remember him being on this photograph. It's a very well taken photograph, but it's insane. Anyway. Yeah.
I like it. They've got the little braids of grass, which look like they could be corn, or like wheat.
Yeah. No, I mean it's a great
farm thing.
Photograph of our time, but also slightly fascinating and bonkers.
There you go.
I think, Montana doesn't feel like natural Democratic territory, but as you say, he's already won a gubernatorial race, so he's persuaded probably a smaller turnout, but a plurality of voters to vote for him.
Yeah.
what will be interesting is to see how strong, because Trump's vote is going to turn out.
Mm-hmm.
So how much that still exists, and how much he can drag Joe Biden on his coattails, or whether it's Trump dragging the Republican on his.
Yeah, 100%. But I mean, I think this is the kind of thing Democrats need to be able to do if we're going to ever win the Senate, because the Senate is just structured inherently in a way that disadvantages a party that is more urban in its makeup, and where density favors us. The Senate just disfavors us generally. So we will always need to find ways of winning Senate seats in states that we won't win presidentially. And, you know, you can argue, and I would argue, that structurally that makes American politics more conservative, less radical than it would otherwise be. But that's the rules. I think just taking a look back at the kind of overall Senate picture, I think one thing to bear in mind, I think there are really good opportunities in the Senate for us this year. And I think most of the reporting on this has started to say it looks like a better Democratic year in the Senate than we were previously predicting, which is great. The downside of that is we kind of need it to be, because the next couple of election cycles look a lot harder for us. You know, as I was saying, because only a third of the Senate runs in each cycle, we have a lot more opportunities in this cycle. There are a lot more kind of Republicans running in Democratic leaning states that would give us opportunities to pick up than there will be in the next couple of cycles. So if we can't win in this one.
And also, if you do win the presidency, that then goes against you generally.
It makes midterms harder.
How strong the memory of Trump remains, but yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So if we don't win the Senate this time, it will look difficult for us to reclaim it in the next couple of election cycles after that. So it's kind of all to play for here. Right. What about the House? Well, the House is, you know, cautiously good news again. Right now, we are on track to keep our majority. The real risk looks like the possibility that it could be a reduced majority, or of course, it could be an increased majority. But right now, if you just draw the line, as you can see in the middle of this diagram, if you just look at where we are kind of pretty comfortably in the polls. We are on track to keep a majority. There are about 22 seats in the middle that are toss-up seats, and then Republicans are defending a lot of seats that they're in prospect to potentially lose. 16 of the 22 districts that are rated a toss-up are currently Democratic held, compared to just 6 for Republicans. That means, obviously, we won in 2018 a lot of seats that we, quote, shouldn't have won, that were Republican-leaning districts, which means we have a lot of kind of close seats now. So there's the prospect that we could lose them, and that's why I would say we would have a reduced majority. But it's still, I mean, unless something breaks against us, which it absolutely could, right now, we still should hold on to enough to keep the majority. But just as an indication of the kinds of challenges that we have ahead of us, we recently had a special election in California's 25th district. This is the district that Katie Hill unfortunately had to step down from after winning in 2018, her Orange County district. She had a scandal in which she was accused of having relationships with staff members, and stepped down. A special election was held to fill that seat. And this person, who, Christy Smith, is a Democratic candidate, she lost quite badly last week to the Republican candidate, and the same 2 people are running in November. So this seat, if you're looking for bad news, I don't know why you would do that, but if you're out there looking for bad news, this is the kind of thing that should worry you. Because
you should be looking where the bad news is too.
you need to see the bad news so you know what to do about it. Because we won this seat by 9 points in 2018, and we lost it by nearly 10 points in this special election. Now, it's a special election. It's kind of crazy, you know, things happen differently. But I think this particularly points out to the challenges of getting out the vote in the COVID era. There was, of course, confusion about the ballot, who voted absentee ballot, etc. And of course, a special election has a low turnout. So in the right confluence of low turnout and confusion over ballot access, we absolutely can lose some of these races that we should be winning. So we just need to be wary of that. Emma, any further thoughts on the House?
Um, I mean, the House is so big and varied and complicated. But it's also the most gerrymandered part. I mean, the Senate isn't gerrymandered; it's just bonkers.
Yes.
You know, every state getting two representatives, and that's it, regardless of size of population or size of, Texas and Long Island, but not Long Island, Rhode Island.
Yeah.
Ridiculous. But the House is obviously drawn up in such a way that it's, there are so many ridiculously safe seats that it just, you said there are 22 seats that are contestable here.
22 seats that are break even, that are like really close. Obviously, there are more seats that are leaning one way or the other that are potentially winnable or losable. But yeah, 22 is really the number that's.
I mean, that just doesn't strike me as democratic.
Mm.
That's my main takeaway. That so little will go uncontested, and therefore will have often representatives who are on the extreme fringes because they're in safe seats.
Yeah. Well, that absolutely leads me on to my next section, because governorships and state races are absolutely vital, because it's the governors and the state houses that will be determining the makeup of the, literally drawing the districts for the next round of candidates in subsequent elections. Democrats don't have as many opportunities in the governorships as I would like. Partly that's because we reclaimed some important governorships in 2018. So we've already kind of picked up some of the ones that we were most targeting. Right now, we've got most of the gubernatorial races that look competitive are actually in GOP leaning districts, GOP leaning states. What can we say? I mean, there are safe Democrats like Jay Inslee in Washington State. People like Phil Scott in Vermont, potentially we could win some pickups there, that kind of thing. But for the most part, I don't see a ton of opportunities. It'll be interesting to see who wins the primary to replace Steve Bullock, our new Senate candidate in Montana. Again, that's going to be a really hard one for Democrats to hold on to. So we're projected to lose that race, I would guess. But unless Bullock can pull somebody through on his coattails, which he might be able to do. You've got places like North Carolina, which is currently held by a Democratic governor, which we won, I think in 2018, we won that race. Was it 2018 or 2010? Anyway, recently. And even though the state is still Republican leaning, we're kind of expected to hold on to that seat. So that's good. New Hampshire is held by a Republican governor. Yes, we could pick that up. I think New Hampshire is fertile territory for us, but Sununu's been fairly popular, so I would be surprised. It's kind of all to play for, but not massively. Doesn't look like a massive swing in the governorships. State houses, on the other hand, are another kettle of fish. These are absolutely essential. It is the state legislatures that will be drawing the redistricting, as I said. And we have some really interesting opportunities here. Best opportunities here, Arizona, which is kind of becoming interesting everywhere. Arizona currently has a trifecta of governance. That means it is held by a Republican governor and two Republican houses of Congress, of state Congress. With just two seats of gain, we can break that trifecta and regain control of the Senate chamber. Iowa, similarly, we've got just a 2-seat gain would make a big difference. We would break the trifecta of Republican governance in that state. In Michigan, we just need to gain 4 seats. Now, Arizona and Michigan, obviously 2 really important presidential states for us as well. So we'll see a lot of turnout activity working there, which might work in our favor for state houses as well. So it would be to take control. There is divided government in Michigan. This would give us another chamber of government, which would be really helpful, especially to Gretchen Whitmer, the governor and the Democratic governor in Michigan, who's doing a fantastic job. Minnesota, we just need to gain 2 seats and we can get control of that chamber. There's a lot of interesting things going on. Things to watch out for.
Where a Democrat lost in 2018, though, wasn't it?
The Minnesota?
Was it not Minnesota? Maybe I'm thinking.
Do you think, are you thinking of Senate, or are you thinking of
I
what?
am, yeah, not in the state house, but in
Yeah,
the
no, Amy Klobuchar's senator, for we have two Democratic senators in Minnesota, I'm pretty sure.
well, I can't think of where I'm thinking of. There was a somewhere up that way.
Somewhere up that way, yeah. Trying to think what you mean, but anyway.
Anyway, sorry.
And then potential losses. So Alaska, which we have no right to control anyway, because it's a strong Republican state, but it's currently controlled by this strange coalition of, even though there's a Republican majority, some of the Republicans in the state house aligned themselves with independents and a group of and Democrats, and they kind of created this weird coalition. That's likely to, well, we'll see, but that weird coalition is likely to not stand. And
Driving force of that.
Sorry?
What's the driving force of that?
Oh, just internal Alaska, because Alaska be weird. Yeah, just internal shenanigans amongst Alaskan politics. Colorado, the GOP is trying to break our own trifecta, the Democratic trifecta of leadership in the state of Colorado. They need 2 seats to do that. Delaware, similarly, the GOP is trying to get, with just three seats, they could pick up and take control of that state house, which would be bitterly ironic, considering that it's their Democratic senator who's on the presidential ballot for us, but we'll see how we go. So yeah, there's a lot going on at the state house level, and one of the things I've been really encouraged by since the previous round of state house votes is these seats have started to get a little bit more attention. There are new organizations out there that are focused just on concentrating on these local races. Flippable is one, but I know there are 2 or 3 other organizations that are really trying to focus people's attention on state house races, and I think that's fantastic. And my call to donors, so my 2 advices to people who are, bits of advice to people who are thinking of giving money, whatever 5 or 10 pounds they can scrape up, $10 they can scrape up here or there, or 50 or 500 or whatever you can give, would be 1, look at Sarah Gideon, because I think she's not getting as much money as she should considering her pivotal role in the race. And 2, your money goes a lot further in state house races. You know, a single check for $1,000 doesn't mean that much to a Senate campaign, but it could make all the difference in the world to an individual state house candidate who basically spend very, very little money to have a huge impact on our democracy.
And yeah, also remember that the state houses are the engine room. That's where you build future national candidates. That's where you do redistricting. It's where all of the politics of the doorstep actually happen. You know, bins and dog shit, as we call it in local council in the UK.
Parking, potholes.
Yeah. Parking and potholes, exactly. Parking and potholes if you're a Lib Dem.
Absolutely, 100%. And I think as we're learning, a lot of important policies, like, for example, virus preparedness, right? Pandemic preparedness happens at the national level, but is actually delivered at the state level.
So didn't happen at the national level. That was the problem.
Should happen at the national level, doesn't, and therefore states do their job. Education, if you care about education at all, for God's sakes, throw all your energy into state and local races, because they're the ones who make the decisions on these things.
And education, of course, was huge in getting rid of Scott Walker, wasn't it, in Wisconsin?
Eventually it was, yes. And the teachers union, and in fact, Tony Evers, the Democratic governor who defeated Scott Walker, was a teacher and was an activist in an education trade union. So 100%. Yeah, so get on it, guys. So we've looked at kind of a really pretty broad cross-section of the election, and there's a lot going on in November 2020. My takeaway is that we are in a pretty strong position. I know that, you know, this is an era where Democrats always want to be like, oh, we can never win because all the factors are against us. And I know that people are inclined to believe that Trump has some sort of magical powers of overtaking all political norms. But that just doesn't bear out. I mean, we won the 2018 midterm election in the House because we did really good groundswell campaigning, because we focused on having good candidates. And we can do that again on every level, from the presidential level on down. Donald Trump does not have have magical powers. In fact, he is losing a lot of the support that he previously relied upon. Having said all of that, this is going to be the hardest GOTV operation that any of us have ever been alive to experience. We have never had to campaign at a time of national pandemic at this scale. We have never had to campaign at a time of, massive unemployment. I mean, I think we're at 17% unemployment and rising. We've never had to campaign at a time when we can't hold rallies, when we can't do canvassing. We don't know how this is going to go, and I don't think we should make any assumptions about it. I also don't think we should make any assumption about the election being free or fair. Democrats need to be aware that Republicans up and down the ballot are terrified that they will lose their power, and they will suppress or block our vote at every turn if we allow them to do so. So we need to be really sharp on picking up any unlawful activity, and we need to be organized to overcome lawful but unethical attempts to suppress our vote here and everywhere. If we do not take the Senate in 2020, things will get a lot harder for us electorally because the next couple election cycles, but also in terms of governing. Even if we win the presidency, as we certainly saw in a lot of the Obama era, and indeed as Democrats have been able to curtail a lot of Trump's attempts to get things through legislatively, we will need to have some kind of governing partnership in place so that a future President Biden can actually deliver on some of these things that we dream of doing. So it's really, really important that we focus on the Senate. It's just going to be really hard. It's just going to be really hard, and we will have to put everything we have into it in whatever way we can. But the victory is there for the taking. Emma, what do you reckon?
I think that's the right balance of caution and optimism. I'm probably a little more pessimistic than you, just because emotionally I just can't take being optimistic at the moment.
Yeah, I think a lot of people feel that way.
But I also know that optimism is essential to actually getting people gunned up to go out and do the work. If you just convince yourself that nothing's going to work and it's all going to be dreadful, then you won't do that. And that would be a self-fulfilling prophecy. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, cautiously optimistic is a good place to land, I think.
Yeah, cautiously optimistic, and the caution is provided we do the work, right? We just need to hit the ground.
And here's another thing that you haven't covered here, but I do think is another thing that worries me slightly, keeps me up at night. The Trump guys are really good at online and have a huge head start, and always did. And when this was going to be a normal election, that worried me.
Yeah.
Now that online is almost all we have, that terrifies me.
Yeah. So I think it's worth unpacking that into a couple of different things. So what does it mean to be good at online, right? And I know you don't mean this, but just to be absolutely clear. So in the 2016 election, there was a lot of talk about Trump's Facebook activity. And I think a lot of that was overblown, in that he didn't have any kind of, Cambridge Analytica persuaded a lot of people, I think falsely, that they had come up with some kind of clever and radical new innovation for targeting people by their emotional context, and that, and they did indeed break Facebook's own rules in a number of different ways, and arguably some laws to steal people's data. But the impact of doing that was nowhere near as big as people think. The thing that Trump did that was really smart, and that he is still doing in this election, and that the Biden campaign is not anywhere close to matching, is just investing huge in online, huge in paid advertising, and letting the platforms determine performance. So basically, he just ran hundreds and thousands of ads and just kept buying more of the ones that were working well, rather than trying to kind of second guess some big strategy and put out all the money behind one or two ads. Now, some of the ads were malicious, some of the ads were inaccurate. We're going to see a lot more of that in this cycle, and I'm not saying Democrats should do that, but we need to get a lot more agile and a lot more quick on our feet about putting stuff out there in a big way, and Trump already gets that.
We're bringing the Queensberry rules to a gunfight, as I've said before.
Yeah, quite. Yeah, so it's a big challenge. And I think, the good news is I have read that Biden is staffing up on digital quite a lot. But staffing up still means he's doubling his current staff, but his current staff is radically undersized, I would say. So I hope he will double it again after that. They just need more bodies, more people, more stuff, and more money. So that's it. If you have been watching this on the YouTube video version, you should also go to your podcast player of choice and subscribe to Democratically 2020. It is a weekly podcast, or you can always find me on Twitter at KarinJR. Emma, where can people find you?
I'm on Twitter at Emma Burnell _.
Fantastic. As always, you can reach me on Twitter. As I said, this podcast is not affiliated with any organization or entity. It is just me and Emma, and we wish you a happy week.